evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, your host here tonight at the Real Science Exchange. Tonight, we get to dive into the exciting world of performance horses. This arena has grown tremendously over the last decade, and our guests tonight have been leading the way. Joining us at the pub tonight, we have three of the experts in equine nutrition who are helping shape the future of nutrition management.
Tonight's pubcast stories are brought to you by the Keyshure line of chelated minerals. Keyshure and Keyshure Plus deliver proven and consistent bioavailability to maximize performance, and a no-frills pricing approach for greater profitability. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
Dr. Pagan, we'll start with you. Thanks for joining us here at the Exchange. You completed a webinar for us back in August, and you shared some very interesting aspects of feeding for performance. So we're excited to be able to go into a deeper look at that tonight. But before we do, can you tell us what's in your glass tonight?
Well, Scott, all three of us tonight live in the great state of Kentucky, horse capital of the world. Steve and I live in Woodford County, and Woodford County is kind of renowned for its ability to produce bourbon. So tonight I have Woodford Reserve, which is
Awesome.
a fitting thing I think, for us to drink, being from Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorites and one of my old standbys here. So I'm going to assume it is made there in Woodford County.
It is.
All right, super. Joe, would you mind introducing your guest tonight and telling us a little bit about how you got to know each other?
Oh, geez, that's a tough one. I have known Steve Jackson and Laurie Lawrence for well over 30 years, 35, maybe it's coming up on 40 years. And it's interesting because we're actually from the same generation of equine nutritionists. It's interesting because equine nutrition research used to be a really big deal back in the 1800s, early 1900s. Then after that, the tractor was invented and they quit studying horses because it wasn't really important for animal traction. And the discipline really disappeared for several decades. Back in the 60s and the 70s, there was sort of a resurgence of that, where there were more pleasure horses, performance horses. And so universities decided to start studying equine nutrition again. And they recruited scientists who hadn't been trained in equine nutrition to start to train equine nutritionists. And so I'm of that first generation, as is Laurie and Steve. You might refer to us as the greatest generation, or more appropriately, the graybeards and blue hairs now. So we're the first generation, and that's how I know both of them, is because we kind of came up at approximately the same time, and literally we're the first group that was actually trained to be equine nutritionists. There's 2 or 3 generations since then, and in fact, I just hired one of Laurie's recent PhD graduates, so that would be a second generation, and there's even third generation researchers. So we go way, way back.
Well, that's very interesting. Laurie, let's start with you. Now, how did you do you remember when you first met Joe?
I do. We were at a research meeting. I think it might have been in Las Vegas. It was a sports medicine conference, and he was giving a paper there, and I was there to learn. And he was a graduate student at the time. And I remember um, after he was having a discussion with one of the other people who was there, a fellow by the name of David Lambert. David Lambert turned to me and he said, "That guy's really sharp, isn't he?" So that was where I met Joe.
Okay, now I understand you're both Cornelians, and I thought perhaps you had met there.
No, I predated him by a bit.
Okay, all right, very well. Laurie, what's in your glass tonight?
Well, I've got some ale in my glass, and I'm using a glass that I got from the Red Mile when they had their 140th year celebration. And so we, as horse owners, have both thoroughbreds and standardbreds. And so I thought it was appropriate to have my glass from the Red Mile.
Yeah, excellent. And Steve, how did you first meet Joe?
Same way, ENPS, it was called at that point, the Equine Nutrition Physiology Society. And Joe and I are actually probably exactly the same in terms of our graduate work. I was at University of Kentucky and had a major professor, John Baker, who, like Joe's major professor, Dr. Hentz, was kind of the ones that they identified to kind of create a resurgence in equine nutrition. So Joe and I were at numerous meetings together, and I taught at the University of Kentucky and left there in September of '90 to join Joe in developing Kentucky Equine Nutrition. I started to say Bluegrass Equine Nutrition, and then one of the things that I think is one of the best achievements of my life is before I left, ensuring that they were going to hire Laurie Lawrence to take my position. So I've got a tremendous amount of respect for both Joe and Laurie, and they tend to be the scientific leaders. And since I left KER and started Bluegrass Equine Nutrition, I do more consulting, on farm work, management, actual involvement in all aspects of mainly thoroughbred farms.
Very well. So we've certainly assembled a star-studded team, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But before we do, I'd like to introduce my co-host for tonight's conversation, uh, Kari Estes. Kari's joined us for a few special segments, and I'm excited to have her back here at the pub once again. So welcome back, Kari. And what's in your glass tonight? Any bourbon?
No.
Okay.
If you know me, Scott, I am not a big drinker. And I do have to attend a conference here in a few hours, so I've just got water in my glass.
All right. Very well. Understand. So, Joe, to get us started, can you give us a brief overview of Kentucky Equine Research and your facilities there, and what do you do there?
Sure. Well, Kentucky Equine Research is a private company, number one, which is often we are confused as being part of a university. Um, KER again was started in 1988, and it's kind of interesting how it started because as we've already discussed, I went to Cornell for my graduate studies, and it was at a time at Cornell when there was a great group of people there. Peter Van Soest and Dale Bauman, and lots of these guys were churning out all sorts of great science. And Skip Hentz was my major professor, was kind of the one of the leaders in this new resurgent equine nutritionist. And I was trained there and assumed that what you did for a living was you went to a university. So when I graduated from Cornell, I did not have a commercial bone in my body. That was not something that I would have even contemplated. But as fate would have it, there weren't academic positions when I graduated, and I ended up in the feed industry. And it was serendipity, really, because it kind of opened my eyes to the great new world of what was happening in equine nutrition. And so the application of research became a lot more important to me. It was how can you find new things, but also how can you apply them. So after a few years in the American feed industry, I started KER, but its mission was increase the knowledge of the horse industry, but also apply that knowledge. And so really KER was had do research. So we have quite a large research facility, both in Kentucky and in Florida, but also always be thinking about the application of that information. So we really refer to KER as an innovation company. We're trying to find new and improve. Sure, we have to take care of what's going on right now, but really what we're looking for is what is next in line. And I think Steve and I obviously have known each other very well for a long time, and I think really our philosophies about what we're wanting to do is a little different in that he has to take care of business every day. There are horses out there that are being raised today and racehorses that are being trained today. And so, Steve, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your focus is a little more on what is happening now and how to make it done correctly and have the best result. Where we do that at KER, but we also kind of have the luxury of looking ahead. It's like, what new things can we try to develop?
Hmm. Steve, that's a great segue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice now?
Okay. You know, we live right in the center of the thoroughbred industry. It's kind of the mecca for thoroughbreds. And prior to the time that I left KER, I was doing a lot of on-farm consultation, and it's not only what to feed, but how to feed it. And a lot of times when we get into wrecks, um, it's not the feed, it's the feeding management that we need to look at. So I had lots and lots more clients in the thoroughbred industry. And so I decided that, I grew up around horses. I showed horses. I rodeoed as a teenager and up through college. And so I'm intensely involved with grassroots horses. And I think that's one of the things that maybe has made my business somewhat successful, is that horsemanship, because I raise horses myself. I sell horses. I race horses. And so I'm very involved in the industry. And what I found was that a lot of times the information that consumers receive is maybe correct commercially, but when you put it on a farm basis, it really doesn't get the job done in terms of raising a racehorse or a performance horse of any kind, or a halter horse, as far as that's concerned. So I'm busy internationally in Japan and Ireland and England and France and Australia with clients, as well as clients in central Kentucky, trying to interpret, apply the things that Joe and Laurie work at every day, is to take the research to the farm. And it's kind of one of those deals that if I won the lottery, I'd probably do this for free.
Can you talk a little bit about not specific clients, but the types of clients that you consult for?
Most of my clients tend to be upper end thoroughbred owners, either trainers or farm owners, all of them. And interestingly, most of them have become good friends, the actual owner of the farm, as well as the management of the farm. So, we're talking about larger farms in central Kentucky and a couple of farms in Japan and Ireland. And, it's really been a fun deal, because you feel very connected to horses and what they're achieving right now. For instance, this year the odds-on favorite for the Breeders' Cup Classic is Flightline, and he was bred by one of my clients that retained 25%. So I've been going to most of his races, and so you feel a closer relationship to thinking that you had something to do with these horses achieving what they do. Although maybe sometimes that's false. I think good horses sometimes are just a freak of nature, and we're all doing things, all reading from the same book. Any of us that are making feed or making recommendations to people, we're reading from the same book. So there's not that much difference in what people do. So it's the management in general, and matings. I do a lot with matings of stallions to mares, and just a total involvement in the thoroughbred business, mainly.
All right, very good. Lori, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're doing there at the University of Kentucky?
Sure. I'm a professor in the Department of Animal and Food Sciences, which is a great place for an equine nutritionist because we have a number of other nutritionists who work with other species. So I often think, as Joe said, a lot of us were trained, sort of cross-trained, or most of our lectures probably didn't have a lot to do with horse nutrition, but we learned a lot about the basics of nutrition. And so that's always a principle that I've tried to pass on to my graduate students, that they need to be nutritionists first if they want to perhaps go into research or academia, and that there's lots of really wonderful stuff that happens with other species because they're a little bit further ahead of us, and they have um, oftentimes a lot more animals to work with, so they can do a lot of different types of experiments. So I collaborate with a lot of folks here that are not just horse nutritionists, but we're really interested right now in factors that affect mare milk composition and how that then affects the growing foal. But we've done a lot of work looking at forage digestibility and also mineral digestibility and those sorts of things. So my job really is to train graduate students, which I guess become the second or third generation, so that they can go out and train other graduate students so that we keep those young scientists coming along. Whether they end up going into academia or they end up going into the feed industry, we need to keep that pipeline open.
Very well. So, give us an idea of what state-of-the-art nutrition was when you first began practicing, and what are some of the key advancements you've seen over the years?
Yeah. So I think when I first started, there was a lot of, at least the folks that I was involved with, there was a lot of interest in protein nutrition in horses, and there were a lot of studies that have been done there, possibly reflecting the fact that some of the nutritionists that transferred over into equine had been swine nutritionists, and that was kind of a hot topic. And so protein was a very popular topic, and also amino acids, and a little bit on non-protein nitrogen. And there was just a little tiny bit of work with the horses' microbial community in the large intestine. And really that was sort of a jump off from what they had learned in ruminants. And after that, protein was popular for a while. And then we sort of moved on to energy sources and looking at fat and carbohydrates. And I think that that's really changed the feeding practices across the world. The diets that horses get now, the commercial feeds that are manufactured now, are much different than the ones that were available back in the 1970s and the early 80s. And now today, I think we've moved on, and in many ways from just thinking about energy sources, and now I think there's a lot more interest in sort of functional foods, and also in thinking about how the diet affects the microbial community, and then other things like the sustainability of feeding horses and some of those other types of areas.
Joe, you're in the innovation business. I'm going to ask you the same question. What was some of the things that you've seen change over the years, and what role perhaps have you played in some of those new innovations?
I'm all three of us, I think, again, are coming through the same time, and so we've all sort of experienced the same changes that we've seen. When I started, it was kind of a sweet feed sort of mentality of feeding. They were pretty plain, straightforward sort of feeding programs. About the time that I was a graduate student, Steve and Laurie, there was this big emphasis put on alternative energy sources, particularly fat. So we went through that phase of feeding fat for performance horses, and that has sort of melded into feeding fat to anything that you can catch. And I think part of the problems that we've got is in equine nutrition, as is probably in all other sectors. Sometimes a good idea can be taken to extremes, and we realize that actually we're kind of in the phase right now of discovering unintended consequences of things that everyone started to apply without giving a whole lot of thought to where they were going. So one of the main things we're studying right now, in fact, is, are there some unintended consequences of feeding real high fat diets and the types of fats we're feeding? And if there is, which I would argue there are some problems with that, can we fix it? And so that's one of the things we're trying to do by selectively giving different types of polyunsaturated fats to correct some of the imbalances that have started. About the time that I started also, or a little, well, about the time that I got into the commercial industry, on the growing horse side, there was a real emphasis on skeletal disorders, osteochondrosis, that sort of thing. And some work at Ohio State suggested that there were some trace minerals that were important. And everybody in the industry set their hair on fire about that, that was suddenly what caused every problem that there was. And so everybody went down that rabbit hole for a long time. I think to a certain degree, that's kind of has been litigated and resolved to a certain degree, but we're still looking at, well, what are causing some of these issues? And we're currently trying to do some large field studies looking at how horses, how their body weight and growth rates may play a role in some of these disorders that are unrelated to those specific mineral intakes. So those are two of the areas that we're interested in. One of the things that I think I'm sad about, and I think in conversations with Laurie and Steve that we're all sad about, is that when we first got into this, and Laurie, I remember that was Reno actually in 1985
Okay.
that you're talking about, we were all interested in performance horses and high performance horses and how to increase performance. I still am. Steve still is. Laurie still is, because they're both racehorse breeders and owners, and so am I. But the industry has gone away from that towards what do we do about the fat horse, the under exercised horse, the horse. I mean, it's a lot like human society. Horses are getting more obese, and they're having all these metabolic disorders related to that. And I just think that's kind of sad when I go to a lot of the scientific meetings now, and I see most of the research is on those horses as opposed to the horses that we really are interested in that we started with, and that was the equine athlete.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I show hunters, and I feel like most of the horses in the hunter show world are grossly overweight. But it seems like that's what these horse owners want, a little bit more fat on their horses. So
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
for sure. I was a judge for years, and the classes of horses that are always too damn fat are halter horses and show hunters.
mhm.
And it's because that's what the judges prefer, is something round. Now when you go to jumpers and so on, then it's not as pervasive, but they want them like large fat horses. And that's one of the things. Sorry, Joe, for I mean, this is a pet peeve of mine.
I figured it was.
it, it, uh, the thing that bothers me the most is that instead of educating owners about what we're talking about and insulin resistance and so on, is that we've said oats are poison. We haven't, because we're nutritionists, but people look for quick fixes and drugs to fix this. And so I'm 69. I'm close to retirement. I don't have anything to lose. So I'm fairly direct with them and say, look, it's just like you. You need to take ownership of the condition of the horse. People are fat. Obesity is the biggest problem we face in the US in humans, and it is in horses. But instead of people uh, teaching consumers, horse owners, how to take control of that, they put them on 18 different drugs. And it's easy. Joe and I both kind of worked a lot on energy metabolism when we were graduate students, and even when Joe and I were working at KER together, that was one of the things that we really worked on because of the proximity to the racehorse business. And it's really simple mathematics for humans and horses. If you eat too damn much, you get fat. If you don't eat enough, you get thin. If you eat the appropriate amount of food, you're at maintenance. And there's no quick fix other than to take control of intake on horses. And we cause a lot of the problems. Humans cause many of the problems that modern horses have because we treat them like a damn Labrador instead of an athlete. Sorry,
Well, I think to me, what illustrates this better than anything is there was a organization that was formed in 1982 called ICEEP. It's the International Conference on Equine Exercise Physiology, and it's when all the great thinkers in exercise physiology got together. And every 4 years, they had a conference on advances in equine exercise physiology. This year, they had the latest one, and one of the titles, one of the only nutrition talks at that was, I may get the title not quite right, but it's something along the lines of judges prefer adiposity in athletic ponies. Now, that was a friggin'
yeah,
talk at
Is that
ICEEP.
even an oxymoron?
And it's an oxymoron to boot.
yeah.
But it's like, whoa, things have really changed. If that's the science that we have in our premier exercise physiology conference, is to discover what Steve said he knew a long time ago. Judges prefer fat ponies and hunters, but it's really a sad statement on kind of the priorities right now, and it's trying to fix this problem of fatness, but not by going about the sensible way that Steve suggested, um, how to make them thin.
But at any rate, we use like ration balancers, and we've been doing this, Joe, for 30 years. I left in 90, and this is 30 years. We've been using concentrates or ration balancers in addition to good quality forage for a lot of horses, or even in young growing horses where we consider that the condition of the horse is excessive. I'll put them on a kilo a day of a ration balancer or 500 grams so that people satisfied their need to feed without increased caloric intake.
No, I think from my perspective, so I'm an academician and I work with a lot of other academicians, and I think feeding practices in horses have been heavily influenced by feeding practices with other species. And so one of the things that we all have our pet peeves. This is one of mine, and I think that the forage specialists in our plant and soil scientists in our university think I'm a heretic because the typical recommendations for pasture management, both the varieties that are selected as well as the management practices, have been developed to promote rapid gain in cows and sheep and other grazing animals. And that's not what we want. And it's certainly not what horses that are 15 years old need.
So maybe for our listeners, do you think you could give us some examples of a low, moderate, and high performance horse
Yeah.
or
I'll let,
horse in work?
I'll let Joe take that and see if he has some guidelines that he gives to folks.
Well, I mean, in the high category, I think racehorses. Laurie's already said racehorses, advanced 3-day event horses, polo ponies. Those are horses that are working very hard. In the middle area, there would be other sport horses that are being exercised daily on a regular basis. That would be show jumpers, even dressage horses at an upper level. Uh, the low level is the recreational horse, and I think that that's the one that is actually the majority of the horses around. So, Scott, you ask about innovations. One of the things that we're working with is the idea of using some technologies that will allow horse owners to realize just how little they are riding. And whether that's cell phone apps, whether it's wearable technology, the sort of thing where you can collect those data and understand how much a horse is really working, and then have a nutrition program that fits. Whenever we try to do any sort of nutrition advising to amateur riders, almost every time they overestimate how hard they're working. And so if we give them advice based on that type of input, we're going to get it wrong, and we're going to help make the problem worse. So trying to understand that is one of the hardest things for horse owners to do.
I think the other thing is that we've been schooled, um, or we've schooled people that when they're selecting hay, that they should be selecting for high quality hay, which is green and leafy and fresh, and that's all well and good. And that would be great if you were feeding a calf to grow. Um, and it's great if you really do have a high performance horse that needs every calorie they can find. But for the majority of the horses, they don't need that. They need STEMI. And it needs to be clean. It just doesn't need to be that highly nutritious hay. And I think people have a hard time if they look at green and leafy versus kind of average grass hay that's a little bit stemmy and kind of grayish colored. They have a hard time making that choice. But that's another thing where we've taught them something that sort of applies to another animal, but not really to the animal that they have.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that Laurie is doing, and the people in the agronomy department up there, is emphasizing forage species that are appropriate, not only as hay but also as pasture. Um, people think about global warming, and well, it doesn't affect us and so on. But in central Kentucky, I'm convinced that global warming has totally changed what kind of plants are predominant in our pastures. When I came up here in 75, there were pure bluegrass pastures. I mean, that's all, maybe some white clover or something. Now it's more like we have weedy grasses, nimblewill, warm season grasses that are not appropriate really for horses, and less cool season grasses. So it's like the cool season grass country has moved up some, and so a lot of the environmental things that we see kind of change that. And when you come to hay, if you go to California, it costs you a lot more money for a bale of Timothy hay than it does a bale of alfalfa hay. And I'm a huge alfalfa fan. I mean, on my own farm and on most of my clients, we feed mixed alfalfa, orchard grass, or straight alfalfa. You just can't feed it full free choice because it is very calorific. And we've done a poor job uh, actually of talking about forage to consumers, and there's a lot of wives' tales out there in terms of forage species that are incorrect. And believe it or not, we just, in 45 years, we haven't really made a lot of progress in teaching consumers or veterinarians the appropriate things about different forages that make a huge difference. I've got lots of mares in central Kentucky eating hay and or pasture in a supplement pellet, and they're still too fat. So why do they do that? Well, one of the things is they know I can feed 4 pounds or 4 quarts. I mean, a lot of people won't even go to weight. They're still talking about volume, and they know what they're feeding. But how do they determine how much forage that they're feeding? And because they don't know, then basically their approach is we're going to meet the requirements with concentrates, and the grass is gravy. And that's backwards from what it should be. But we just haven't been very effective in general of teaching people what expected forage intake would be. And there are a lot of horses that do hard work that are on forage alone, on hay alone. In California, I have a lot of clients that have cutting horses or roping horses, hard-working horses, and they feed them alfalfa cubes and salt, full stop, and they look magnificent, magnificent. So forage ought to be the first thing we talk about, to me.
Yeah, Steve, you mentioned that we haven't done a very good job of educating people on how to feed their horses. I'm wondering, who is we, right? I mean, who's responsible for teaching specifically recreational people that own recreational horses? It seems like a huge task to me. Laurie, is that something universities ought to be doing? Feed companies? Where does that responsibility lie?
Well, everybody, and I think there's a couple things that are a little bit different about the horse world from the standpoint of universities than maybe is applies to other animals. But um, one of those is that horse owners tend to be pretty transient. So a lot of horse owners may get into the horse industry or become a horse owner when they have a child who wants to take lessons and then have a horse, something like that. And then, they're in it for 5 or 6 or 8 years and then they go out. And so the parents get somewhat educated and then they move on. So it's not necessarily, at Steve's level and at Joe's level where you've got, high level competition, those are more professional level. But here we've got a lot of folks that come in, they come and they go. They're not like your average beef farmer or sheep farmer. um, they also don't have an agricultural background necessarily, so they may start owning a horse and not have any idea what the difference is between alfalfa and timothy hay. And they're usually not really attached to the cooperative extension service. And so in agriculture, people that come from an agricultural background are often familiar with their county agent and what those agents can do for them and what the cooperative extension service can do for them. But folks that come from a more suburban environment would never be aware of that. And so that educational pathway, that person that could help them on the ground sample their hay and provide pasture management, that kind of stuff, they don't even know exist. And so it's a different sort of thing. And so I think some of my extension colleagues would say that they're teaching the same stuff now that they were teaching 15 years ago because it's different people. And so you start out teaching them about forage, and by the time they get it, they've left and a whole new crowd has come in. So um, it's a little bit, it's certainly important. And I think at the undergraduate level, many programs do the best they can to teach that kind of information. But again, nutrition might be a class that they take as opposed to something that they would spend a lot of time actually delving into.
Lori, while you have the floor, I kind of wanted to dig into another topic, and that's the NRC. I understand that you are the chair of the NRC that's looking into updating it. When's the last time that the equine NRC was updated?
Well, the last edition was published in 2007. I was chair of that committee that did those updates. Um, once the new edition is published, the committee is disbanded, and so since that time, I haven't had any communications with the NRC about that. I did have an inquiry from a person in the feed industry a couple months ago, and gave them the name of someone that I thought might have information. But one of the mm, stumbling blocks for that is that today there's very little internal funding from the National Research Council to update those publications. And so you usually have to raise money from the industry. And so um, that is a fairly sizable amount of money because it has to help pay for the staff and the editing and the technical editing and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so it's been a few years. Does it need to be updated? That's that kind of the group.
Yeah, I would say there are certainly sections of it that need to be updated.
I think that there are places in the NRC that probably need revision. There's some mistakes, to be real honest, in the NRC that need to be corrected. Um, I think it's still a very useful document. I'm not sure. One of the things that I've told people is that from the beginning, when I started reading and trying to absorb the NRC, uh, requirements, every single change that has been made in each of the additions is to increase the horse's requirement for nutrients. There's not been a single case where they have said, no, we got this wrong. This is too much. The requirement should be less. And I think it's human nature, both in human nutrition and horse nutrition, to always look for deficiencies or things that we are not doing enough of. In reality, I don't think that there is a single place in the NRC that says we need to increase this some because it's deficient. And I mean, I study the document a lot, don't I, Laurie? I mean, I'll call Laurie and say, well, how about the lysine requirement for lactating mares or whatever? And to be real honest, I mean, I'd love to see it revised, but I can't, from a practical standpoint, read that document and say, I know this is deficient, we need to increase it. But that's been the nature of the beast, is to always increase requirements. And then if we take increased requirements and then make a commercial increase as well, so that the feed tag, mine's bigger than yours, then we're, in the last 100 evaluations I've done, I can't remember ever seeing a nutrient that I thought was deficient. On the other hand, I don't remember doing one where I didn't think, man, this is way too much of XYZ nutrient. Why do we need this much of trace minerals or vitamins and so on? So, I'm a dinosaur. There's no doubt. I'm conservative. I'm like Laurie. I learned basic nutrition from John Baker and applied it. I just don't think that if all we're going to do is increase the numbers in a new NRC, we don't need it.
Is there a better way to establish requirements other than the NRC?
I don't know. I think no. I mean, there's nothing in the NRC that is toxic, but I don't know of anything in the NRC that is out of line. So, and that's what makes you angry sometimes, is the NRC is the product of a lot of pretty smart people getting together, getting assigned sections to try to make sure that we have the most current research represented in that document. And then from a commercial standpoint, that's just the minimum. Well, it's not the minimum. For me, it's a lot of it's the maximum. So a lot of it is input from consumers and veterinarians, and talking about education, that anything about a horse, anything, the first source of information that people go for is veterinarians, except for close clients of Joe's or Laurie's or mine that know that we're going to give them, and I think that we do generally a poor job of educating practitioners on nutrition, and there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction in terms of recommendations, and so the last year or two I've tried to make it a point to really get involved in continuing education for practitioners, so that they have accurate things to say about forage types and about how much feed and about fat and so on, because it's just like doctors. Where do you go to for information on anything associated with health other than your doctor? Now, he hates to see me come because I'm asking pretty pointed questions, but if the doctor and the vet are the place that people go for information, then we need to, and I know Joe has done this for a long time, get involved with getting information to practitioners that's accurate and actually commercially viable.
I can kind of jump in there with an example. I was doing a nutrition evaluation for a farm here in town about 3 years ago, and the the two veterinarians that did the work on the farm were in the meeting, along with the farm owner and their managers. And one of the veterinarians was talking about her practice of normally giving all the foals that were born a shot of selenium. And the farm owner asked her why she did that. She said, well, because I think that the forage here, the grass here, is selenium deficient. And he said to me, he said, is that true? I said, well, it is true that our ground here tends to be selenium marginal or selenium deficient. He said, but don't the mares get selenium in their concentrate? And I said, well, yes, they do. But I don't think she knew that. I don't think, that wasn't part of, she didn't put those parts together, so I do think that, and Joe's always really focused on that. I think we need to continue to do that, although I do think that veterinarians are becoming much more interested in nutrition. I get a lot more questions from them than I used to.
Yeah, the biggest thing I can see them wanting to get involved to right now is, not on even know if I use the correct terminology, is the microbiome, or the microbial content of the cecum and large colon and its effect on health. And we've always said, I think all three of us have always said, that the more we learn about feeding horses, the more important we consider the hind gut to be. And a healthy hind gut is a result of of forage intake and microbial fermentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like the things that are being done now, I think this is the first time anybody has ever known that we have a microbiome to consider. And when I came to Kentucky in '75, Dr. Baker already had, my professor already had like 4 or 5 cecal fistulated horses, where they were doing research on the effective feed intake or type of feeds on the microbial numeration of the hindgut, and that was in '75. So it's not, horses have always had a hindgut. There always been bacteria there, and it's like, oh, this is a new deal. You need to get this probiotic or prebiotic and feed it, and it's we go in cycles, don't we, Joe? We'll go back 30 years, and really there's nothing that's new. We do have a hell of a lot better analytical techniques that we can use, but it's not like nobody in the past has considered these questions that we continue to ask.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of amusing. There was a conference, an animal science conference, when they were talking about the equine microbiome and what a discovery it was. And I was thinking, none of these people have drunk very much beer with Peter Van Soos back in the 80s or the 70s, because we kind of already knew that. But to kind of throw in my 2 cents about the NRC, I think there definitely needs to be a considered review of what advancements have been made in a place where people can find them and use them. I have not been on an NRC committee, and the reason I haven't is the sort of the structure of the NRC is that it's an academic organization. I was asked to be an outside reviewer of the NRC, but because I was commercial, they me or Steve or Pat Harris or whoever was not really allowed a seat at the table, which is sort of bizarre, really, because we're the ones who are actually going to end up applying this sort of thing. So I think the people that were on the NRC had their hands tied to a certain degree by what evidence they could use and how they could interpret the evidence. I would say maybe something that's a little more useful right now, that might get a little more funding activity, actually, rather than a full-blown NRC, would be some way that consensus statements could be produced about important topics. And if you could get a blue ribbon panel of experts, whether they're academic or commercial, you need a mixture of both that can review the available evidence and put it in the context of what happens in practicality and speak with a united voice about how a specific topic. Part of the problem now, when Steve and I were going early in KER, there was no internet. That's not how information was transmitted. Now you can't get away from the internet, and there's such a fire hose of opinions and misinformation that people have access to. It's kind of hard to separate that out from what is really true. So I mean, I would wholeheartedly endorse and probably help fund a way that we could create some consensus statements about important topics that aren't even really covered in the NRC except peripherally, that people think a lot about. I mean, we are obsessed with fat and whatnot, but there's not a fat requirement in the NRC. I mean, in grams per day or grams per day of neutral detergent fiber for that matter, things that we have to deal with kind of on an everyday basis. So I mean, I think there needs to be a way for that information to be interpreted and disseminated, but I'm not sure that the NRC is the way these days. The way that we're looking at nutrients, and from a commercial viewpoint, almost always more is better, and that's how you show the value of your product is by having more. I think there is a real effort to rethink that, and in fact, the PhD that I just hired that Laurie trained did all of her work on phosphorus requirements in horses, and I think what her work showed is that we're probably overestimating the amount of phosphorus that's required. It costs a lot of money, and then there's some environmental aspects to what happens to all that phosphorus as well. So I think what you're going to see is there will be research in the future that looks at those nutrition from a different sort of viewpoint, and that is of overnutrition, because I think that may be more of a problem now in a lot of areas. Either it's calorically or just with some other nutrients that we don't even really understand what this overnutrition is doing. It's not enough to kill a horse, but Laurie, when you're giving 1.5 grams of zinc a day to a horse, is that doing anything to its hind gut? What is it doing to the bugs that are back there? These are, I think, important things that we need to contemplate and look at the idea not of black and white, binary, deficient or excess, but what are acceptable ranges, and at what point are there some unintended consequences that we really haven't got our hands on yet. So I think that would be a better way to approach some of this in the future.
Yeah.
And I think if in my own, I think one of the things that's happened through the pandemic, at least from my standpoint, is that because of ingredient cost and diversion of ingredients to making biofuels and so on, that some of the ingredients that we've depended on for a long time are in less supply. And we always, Joe and I both came through the fat era. I had graduate students that did work on fat for performance horses and so on, Dr. Steve Duren. And we thought it was a great idea because it's energy dense, you don't add any starch, et cetera, et cetera. But when fat, a percent fat added $25 to $30 a ton to horse feed, Joe and I had a discussion, 2 months ago, Joe, that maybe we don't need fat in a lot of diets. There are types of fats that are effective in performance horses, but with horses getting too damn fat anyway, I took fat out of most of my rations in the last 30 days because I really couldn't justify the cost of it. And it used to be cheap, so oats, for instance, they're making oat replacement feeds now that have the same nutrient composition as oats, but are not oats, made out of oat feed and so on. And the market, we went 30 days ago where most of the sweet feed in central Kentucky went up $6 a bag in one fell swoop after having already been increased in March. So you take these big deals. Every single one of my clients called, every one of them called me, do I need to do something different? And some of them decided, yeah, it went up, but I'm confident in feeding this way and so on, and they stayed the same. But we went to a lot of farms went to cubes because we're using co-products of the human nutrition things to make these feeds. So the phosphorus thing, Scott, I think we talked about the other day. In some countries, it's already legislated because of environmental and algae bloom and so on. And in Europe, they're very, very particular about runoff of nutrients from farms, and a lot of the big places have places that they can put waste and let it and not run off into the creeks and streams. So all of these things are, that it kind of goes along with there are a lot of people, a lot of my friends from Texas that say global warming is bullshit. It's just a political thing. And then all of a sudden, 30 years later, you find out that a lot of these things that we're doing environmentally are very, very negative. And that includes overfeeding animals or inappropriate nutrient concentrations in animal feed that we really need to consider.
We're getting pretty close to done here, but there's one area I wanted to kind of dig into before we depart. And that is, Steve, before you said there's not a lot new, there is one thing that is new, and that's epigenetics. Some recent research that Balchem sponsored at a couple of your alma maters, Cornell, and this was done with humans. They actually supplemented choline to mothers during gestation, and then with the objective of improving cognitive function and development. And then they measured the mental acuity or focus of those children as infants, and they came back 7 years later and measured their ability to focus then at 7 years old. And they found that the children whose mothers were supplemented with additional choline had a significant amount of better focus than the children whose mothers did not. And I'm wondering, is there a role for something like that, or research, Laurie, looking at that in equine, right? Improving the ability, the trainability of horses, and just kind of curious if you guys have given anything like that any thought.
Well, actually, the folks down at the University of Florida have done some experiments back looking at omega-3 fatty acids, and then in feeding the mares, and then looking at some of the um, trainability characteristics of the foals. I don't know that they were able to make a strong conclusion. Of course, one of the huge issues is having large enough populations that you can actually see differences, because the differences are not likely to be, or our ability to detect the differences in horses are not likely to be huge, right? So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting thing. And certainly what Steve was just talking about, and Joe earlier, we've been probably over supplementing brood mares for a long time with many different types of trace minerals, and whether those things have an effect on the foals over time, I don't know. I wonder, I look at all these horses that have insulin resistance, some of them not even apparently overweight, but they're insulin dysregulated. They're 10 years old or 8 years old. And I think, how can that even be? And so I think maybe it's a multi-generational type of thing that we just haven't really recognized.
Yeah, it's a complex thing, and it's difficult. And unfortunately, I'm not as involved going to every scientific meeting, but most of my colleagues are my same age, are very, very close. And I don't see a hell of a lot of new generation of Joe Pagans and Laurie Lawrences. It's probably good there's not another generation of Steve Jacksons, but where is the next group of like gurus coming from? I don't know.
Well, I think that's a great place to maybe stop for all those young students out there listening. There's a need in equine nutrition. So I would, I don't know who to call. Call Laurie, I guess. There's a need out there. Call. I don't know if you guys just noticed, but they flickered the lights. That means it is last call. I'm almost out of beer, so I think we'll call it quits there. But before we do, I'd like to ask each of you to kind of give us, 1, 2, 3 key takeaways from our conversation this afternoon for the audience. And Steve, why don't we start with you?
All right. Don't overfeed. Make sure that you know the body condition that is appropriate for the horse that you're using, and feed him due to that. Is a basic should be common sense nutrition. Is the body condition is first, and then you can fluctuate on how you get the trace minerals and so on in there. If it's nutritionist, tell people the truth. Make sure that they understand the actual function of the horse's GI tract and how important forage is. I have been for a long time, but particularly now a forage fan. And I think there are a lot of old wives' tales that need to be dispelled in terms of what forage species are appropriate for horses.
Kari, what comments do you have for us?
Well, I think as a horse owner myself, listening to this conversation, there's so much information on the internet, right? Good, bad, ugly. So do your research and seek help from somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? Not just another horse owner on the internet. Go to a nutritionist and I guess your vet too. Encourage them to learn or go to a nutritionist as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kari. And Laurie, what kind of final comments do you have for us?
Yeah, I thought what Steve said was good. I think as nutritionists, we all need to probably do a better job of educating the people who actually advise horse owners. So whether those are veterinarians or farriers or horse trainers, people at the lesson barn, that's where incoming horse owners get their information and recreational horse owners get their information. And I think we have plenty of information to solve probably 80% of the problems in the recreational horse industry relative to nutrition. Maybe not the growing horse, maybe not the performance horse, but I think if we just apply what we know, we could probably, and put it into practice, we could probably do a better job of feeding those horses.
All right. Thank you for that, Laurie. And Joe, we'll give you the final words.
Well, I think it's an exciting time because there's a lot of new technologies that can be used to answer some questions that we've had for a long time. Full steam ahead on that, but also use some caution in interpreting and applying some of this, because there are unforeseen circumstances that we really need to pay attention to. So I think we will make strides, but we need to be careful about how we use this technology.
Joe, Laurie, Steve, Kari, first, let me thank you for the enlightening conversation tonight. The equine segment is new to me, and so I've really enjoyed getting to learn more about the intricacies of feeding these amazing athletes. To our loyal listeners, And to those new to the exchange, I want to thank you for coming along with us. We've covered a lot of ground over the last couple of years, and I'd encourage you to go out to either our website or to your favorite podcast platform and take a look at some of the past episodes that we've had. There's a lot of good information out there. Also, if you've got any ideas for other topics that you'd like us to discuss, please reach out to us with those ideas at anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'd like to work with you to bring those to the pub, and you never know, maybe we'll invite you to join us as well. But for now, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We hope you learned something. We hope you had some fun, and we hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.